Hey, how's it going everyone? I'm White Pointer, and despite being technically inferior to its competition, Nintendo's Game Boy was a massive success in the early 90s. To capitalise on this, in 1994, Nintendo launched one of the best ideas for a peripheral of all time for the Super Nintendo home console, the Super Game Boy. This was an add-on that plugged into the Super Nintendo's cartridge slot that allowed you to play Game Boy games on the TV. It was compatible with every game released for the Game Boy and could also play the Game Boy Color games that were backwards compatible. Some games, such as Metroid 2 Return of Samus, could detect when they were running on a Super Game Boy to display the game in the limited color palette, while other games, including Killer Instinct, display customized borders around the game screen. And others still, like Kirby's Dream Land 2, were specifically further enhanced to be able to display in more advanced colors in some situations. Some games did even more than that, but I'm not going to spoil everything straight away. It was a pretty cool little device that didn't cost much more than a standard game cartridge for the SNES and opened up a whole new library of games to play. What's even more cool though is how the peripheral worked. There's surprisingly little information out there on how the unit itself functioned, how it interfaced with the Super Nintendo, and what the Super Nintendo itself was actually doing to display the picture on the screen. So let's deep dive and investigate exactly what made the Super Game Boy so ingenious. So first things first, the Super Game Boy was not simply a Game Boy emulator that used the Super Nintendo to run, because the Super Nintendo was not actually powerful enough to emulate a Game Boy properly. Generally speaking, emulators actually require hardware significantly more powerful than the original hardware to run accurately, and even though the Super Nintendo was a much more powerful machine than the humble Game Boy, it still didn't have quite enough grunt to do the job. So the Super Game Boy actually contained exactly the same internals of a real Game Boy. They both used the same CPU, manufactured by Sharp, and they both had the same amount of RAM, 8KB of work RAM and 8KB of VRAM. The Super Game Boy obviously didn't need the audio amplifier the Game Boy had, as the sound was routed through the Super Nintendo, but it did have a few additional chips. A ROM chip that contained the program code and data that made it all work, a coprocessor to drive it, and a lockout chip that prevented unauthorized games from being played. Super Game Boy games did not display in full screen, but there is a reason for that. The Game Boy's resolution was 160 by 144, so if they had tried to blow it up to the Super Nintendo's standard resolution of 256 by 224, not only would it look blocky and blurry, but it would look horizontally or vertically squashed, as it couldn't be expanded evenly on both axes. So instead, it displayed in the Game Boy's normal 160 by 144 resolution in the middle of the TV, with a border around it to fill up the rest of the screen. The actual clock speed of the CPU in both was set externally rather than internally, but here's where there's a key difference. In the original Game Boy, it was controlled by a crystal oscillator, which set the clock speed to about 4.194 MHz. The Super Game Boy, however, did not have a crystal oscillator, and it was instead controlled by circuitry that took the speed of the Super Nintendo's internal clock, which was 21.477 MHz for NTSC or 21.281 MHz for PAL, and divided it by 5. This resulted in a speed of 4.295 MHz for NTSC or 4.256 MHz for PAL, which was very close to, but not quite the same as the Game Boy's clock speed. So the Super Game Boy actually ran at roughly 2.4% faster than the Game Boy on NTSC and about 1.5% faster on PAL. Most gamers probably wouldn't care about the speed difference or even notice it, especially on a PAL console, but because of this, the use of the Super Game Boy in speedruns is mostly banned, or at the very least requires a separate category. To give you a visual idea of the difference, here's a side-by-side of the attract mode of Donkey Kong Land running on the original Game Boy and the Super Game Boy. In just this short clip, the attract mode level finishes on the Super Game Boy a whole second faster than the original Game Boy, so you can see how this would add up to be a big difference over the course of a speedrun. The faster speed also affected the music, as that was tied to the CPU, which meant that music was faster and higher pitched when running on the Super Game Boy. Here's Donkey Kong Land again. Listen to the jingle on the title screen. It's very noticeable. Nintendo did actually recognise this problem and fixed it with the Super Game Boy 2 that released a few years later, adding a crystal oscillator to the back of the circuit board that correctly set the CPU speed to 4.194 MHz. It also included link cable support. However, the Super Game Boy 2 was only released in Japan and never made it across the ocean, likely because the N64 was in full swing by then. In the years since, modders have worked out how to disable the calculation circuit and manually install a crystal oscillator instead that clocks the CPU to the correct speed, and it's actually not too difficult to do, meaning speedrunners can use modded original hardware if they wish to do so. Now I'll rewind for a moment here because I'm sure some of you are wondering, wait, since when does the Super Nintendo's clock speed run at over 21 MHz? Doesn't it run between 2.68 and 3.58 MHz? The subject of the Super Nintendo's hardware timing isn't as straightforward as you might think, so here's a quick explanation that'll hopefully make it a bit clearer. The Super Nintendo's master clock speed is indeed 21.447 MHz for NTSC or 21.281 MHz for PAL. To make things simpler, I'll just stick to talking about NTSC for this. One CPU cycle though took a certain number of clocks to fully complete, depending on what part of the memory it was accessing. Generally speaking, if it was accessing fast ROM, it would take 6 master clocks, so 21.447 divided by 6 giving an effective speed of 3.58 MHz. If it was accessing slow ROM, which is what most Super Nintendo games used because it was cheaper, it would take 8 master clocks, so 21.447 divided by 8 giving an effective speed of 2.68 MHz. If it was reading the controllers, it would take 12 master clocks, so 21.447 divided by 12 giving an effective speed of 1.79 MHz. So that's where those different numbers come from, and that's where the Super Game Boy's clock speed is calculated from. The circuit takes 21.447 and divides it by 5, setting the clock speed of the device's CPU to 4.295 MHz. Okay, so back to the Super Game Boy, how was the final image actually constructed, and what role did the Super Nintendo hardware actually play? Firstly, the Super Nintendo always operated in mode 1 when the Super Game Boy was being used, so there was a total of 3 layers available. The Super Game Boy built its image the same way as the real Game Boy, with the background layer first, then the window layer if it was used, then the sprite layer on top. This whole image was then drawn to the Super Nintendo's background layer 3, and then colours were applied using the Super Nintendo's hardware. The border was then drawn on background layer 2. Background layer 1 was only used when the inbuilt customization tools were used, and displayed on top of everything else. The sprite layer was only used for the customization cursor and some animations, and something else that I'll get to in a moment. Having a lot of the same hardware as a real Game Boy was all well and good, but how did it turn the video into colour? This is where the extra processor and what's contained on the ROM chip come in. Firstly, we'll look at standard Game Boy games. The Game Boy had a 2-bit monochrome display that gave it 4 colours, essentially 4 shades of green. At a basic level, what the Super Game Boy did was replace those 4 colours with 4 different ones from the Super Nintendo's colour range. By pressing the L and R buttons together on the controller, you could enter a customization menu. Here you could select one of 32 predefined combinations of 4 colours, which would map to each of the 4 shades of green, so you could go through and choose which palette you liked the most. But if you didn't like any of the predefined palettes, you could also create your own, being able to assign one of 60 base colours to any of the 4 Game Boy colours, and then being able to adjust their brightness to one of 7 different levels, giving a total of 420 different colour options to choose from. As you change the colours, a corresponding password would generate at the top of the screen, so once you found the palette you were happy with, you would note this password down so you can easily restore it the next time you played the game, as unfortunately it did not have the ability to save this information. You could also press the X button to quickly swap between 2 different palettes. Even though these games were not specifically enhanced for the Super Game Boy, the unit itself could detect when some of these games were inserted and automatically selected a colour palette to use by default. Games like Metroid 2 Return of Samus did this, as did Super Mario Land, even though both of those games released well before the Super Game Boy was a thing. It was useful if all you wanted to do was quickly play a game with some colour, though the user could still modify the palette as normal if they wanted to. Also provided by the device was the option to change the border around the screen. This was completely on the Super Nintendo's hardware and didn't affect the Game Boy image at all. There were 9 different inbuilt border options, with the Super Game Boy 2 actually providing an additional 9. As with the game colours, there was also an option to create a customised border, though it was incredibly basic and only allowed you to draw thin or thick lines in 12 different colours, with an option to even draw them over the game screen, if you didn't want to see what you were doing when playing for some reason. Each built-in border for both the Super Game Boy and the Super Game Boy 2 had unique idle animations if you didn't touch the controller for a few minutes, and Game Explain recently put out a video that covers all of them if you're interested. These animations were also the other use of the sprite layer that I mentioned earlier. It would also often actually change the background border image slightly to accommodate the animations as well, like removing the pencils on this one to replace them with sprites that could be moved. Lastly, there was an option to change between 2 different button mappings, though for some reason, some games didn't allow this to be used. So that's how standard Game Boy games were colorized, but what about the games that were enhanced for the Super Game Boy? These usually came with their own unique borders to display around the game screen, which, like the built-in ones, were rendered using the Super Nintendo's hardware. Many of these were well done and looked really good, and I think they did enhance the experience. A small handful of games actually contained more than one border, and a special mention needs to go to Street Fighter 2 here because there's a unique border for every stage in the game. These specially enhanced games also commonly had their own customized set of colours, which would often change to display different colours in different levels or locations in the game. Most of the time though, they just colorized the whole screen with the same palette, similar to what could be done with standard games, but some went above and beyond that to actually display more than just 4 colours on screen at once. The Super Game Boy could, in fact, display a different palette of 4 colours on a per tile basis, if the game was set up to do so, displaying a lot more colours on screen than would ordinarily be possible. However, it couldn't really be used on moving images due to how it drew these colorized tiles to the screen, as the palette assigned to each tile would need to be changed every frame to match what the player was doing, which would have created a performance bottleneck. So it was restricted to static images, such as title screens, or what was displayed on the Game Boy's window layer, as that didn't scroll with the rest of the screen. Quite a few games had a different set of colours on their HUD at the top or bottom of the screen actually, such as Kirby's Dream Land 2. It didn't necessarily have to be at the top or bottom of the screen though. Since its battle screens were mostly static, Pokemon Yellow was able to pull off a neat trick to display each Pokemon as well as the life bars in different colours by assigning different palettes to their specific tiles. Each Pokemon in the game would have been set up to use an appropriate palette. There would only be a handful of different palettes in total, mind you, but it was enough to make them look unique. A number of games showed some pretty cool looking static screens that clearly used way more than 4 colours, but the game that's a big showcase for this is undoubtedly the first game released with Super Game Boy enhancements, and that's the 1994 remake of Donkey Kong. Not only does it have smart use of colouring the 4 shades of green during gameplay, which changes for each level, not only does it use a different palette for the HUD at the top of the screen, but it does an amazing job of colouring the level select and bonus screens. Just look how colourful and vibrant these look. If you didn't know any better, you may not have even realised this was a Game Boy game. Not many games went to this kind of extent, but it demonstrated exactly what was possible if the studio put in the extra effort. The device also worked with Game Boy Color games that were backwards compatible with the original Game Boy, which usually had black cartridges. However, these unfortunately did not display in the same colours as they would on an actual Game Boy Color, because they were treated the same as they would be if they were played on an original Game Boy. That is, they were first rendered in the usual 4 shades of green, then colorized by the Super Game Boy the same way as normal games. So they mostly just looked like Wario Land 2 here, but I think FIFA 2000, which I showed a clip of earlier, gets some extra credit for getting pretty close to the Game Boy Color version, even if it does run significantly slower. Beatmania GB, which was Japanese exclusive, also does a pretty good job considering the limitations. It even worked with Pokemon Pinball with its special Rumble cartridge, though understandably the Rumble feature was disabled when playing on the Super Game Boy. If you're enjoying this content, don't forget to subscribe to see more of it. So that was how the Super Game Boy displayed Game Boy games in colour on the TV, but that's not all it could do. It also had a couple of criminally underused features that took advantage of the Super Nintendo's hardware. Firstly, if you were bored of just playing single player, it could actually use the second controller port of the Super Nintendo, making multiplayer possible without the need for a link cable. Not every type of game was suitable for this kind of multiplayer, of course, but fighting games like Killer Instinct could and did take advantage of this feature, which was pretty neat. Secondly, it wasn't just restricted to using Game Boy sound hardware. It could, in fact, utilise the Super Nintendo's much more advanced sound hardware to play enhanced sound. On a rare occasion games took advantage of this, most of the time they used it to play some better quality sound effects. Bomberman GB, for example, replaces the sound effect of the bomb explosions. Sound effects wasn't the only thing it could do though. It could do music as well, and some games added a new track here or there. However, there's only one game I know of that actually went all out and replaced the entire soundtrack, and that was Animaniacs. Have a listen to this. Now, it is understandable why developers didn't do this outside of this example, because obviously it takes more space on the cartridge to have an entirely separate soundtrack, not to mention the extra work involved in making that soundtrack. But it does make you wonder what might have been possible had this been utilised more. It's also worth mentioning how amazing the colour use is in this game. They really did a fantastic job on this all around. Replacing a sound effect or two is one thing, replacing a whole soundtrack is another thing, but how about replacing an entire game? That's exactly what Space Invaders did. Played on a Game Boy, it's a pretty bare bones port. Fire it up on a Super Game Boy and you're presented with a couple of options, Super Game Boy and Arcade. Selecting Super Game Boy allows you to play the Game Boy version with a few different colour options and a custom border. Nothing too unusual there. Selecting Arcade, however, boots the game into an entirely separate Super Nintendo game, complete with its own graphics and sound. Yes, they put an actual 16-bit Super Nintendo game on a Game Boy cartridge that's only accessible when using the Super Game Boy, that's no longer running on the Super Game Boy but on the Super Nintendo itself. Yeah, it's technically no longer a Game Boy game at that point, but it's still pretty cool, made possible by the fact that Space Invaders was a tiny game, so there was enough space on the cartridge to do this. There's one last thing I wanted to cover here, and that's to dispel a myth about the title screen of Mario's Picross. What myth, you may ask? Well, there's a belief that the logo on the title screen is a Super Nintendo sprite being rendered onto the Super Nintendo sprite layer, or that it's using some kind of special mode to do it. This belief probably came about because the logo doesn't change colour if you switch the colour palette. Now, it is true that this logo is being drawn onto a Super Nintendo layer. There's no technical reason why it couldn't draw on top of the Game Boy image. But it's not the sprite layer, it's actually background layer 2, the same layer as the border, and you can see this very clearly in debug tools. The logo is on background layer 2 and the sprite layer is empty. Moreover, if we change the border to one of the others, you can see the logo that's added by the Super Game Boy disappears, revealing another logo behind it that's part of the original Game Boy's graphics. And now, if we change the colour palette, the logo colour will also change, just like everything else. If we switch back to the custom border, then the custom logo also returns. So yeah, it's not a sprite, it's not using some kind of special object mode, it's simply part of the custom border. Why they did this, I'm not entirely certain, but Mario's Picross appears to be the only game that ever uses the hardware this way. Although, if we quickly go back to Animaniacs, we can see it used very subtly to make the corners of the Game Boy image rounded to simulate the look of a TV screen that they were going for. Looking back on it, it's pretty amazing really how Nintendo managed to make this device interface with the Super Nintendo in the way it did. By replicating the Game Boy's hardware and using some software wizardry, you could play Game Boy games on your TV through your SNES. Nintendo will go on to adopt a similar strategy with the Game Boy player for the GameCube, which had nearly identical hardware to the Game Boy Advance. So there you go, I hope you learned something from this video. Did you own a Super Game Boy, or do you still own a Super Game Boy? What was your favourite game? Let me know in the comments. As always, I'll leave some links in the description for you to check out if you're interested in more information. Give me a thumbs up if you like this video, it really helps a lot, and don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date with my content. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.